This channel is supported by TrueFire. TrueFire is an online library of lessons from some of my favourite players. There's thousands of lessons on there. You can use the promo code JNC40 to get 40% off of any of their courses. One of the things that obviously people are interested in when they get into this modelling thing is about how they can make these things work for them live. Now, I've had the experience of using the Laney LFR, I've used for a bit the Line 6 power cab, and also I've had real PA speakers, so RCF Art 312s and Yamaha DXR 15s. I think the received wisdom when it comes to FRFR speakers has been that those are de facto the best way to get an accurate representation of your modeler that can work for live. Now, I would push against some of that wisdom. Now, for me, my experience using most of these products live has been that if you turn off an IR and if you turn off a speaker sim, what you start to get through the kind of, even if it's the Kemper cabinet or the Line 6 power cab, is because they involve special speaker designs where there's a lot of high frequency content, you can quickly get quite horrible tones. To demonstrate that, let me just show you, particularly if you've got driven tones. So here I've got kind of a Mesa Boogie Lone Star with no cab sim going into the Line 6 Catalyst. Now, the Line 6 Catalyst is an actual guitar speaker, right? So in theory, this should be less of an issue than with other products. But what is super obvious is that clearly a guitar speaker is capable of producing some of these really high frequencies that sound pretty gross, right? Now, if we turn on the cab, turn off the cab, turn off the cab, for me, that has been the quickest route to actually achieving enjoyable tones with any of this type of setup. So the received wisdom was get an FRFR cabinet and just run things as they are, or run into like the return of a guitar amp but turn off your IRs and turn off your cabs. What I found actually works best for me is leave on your cabs and plug into the return of an amp. To me, this, then when you turn it up, you don't get loads of this super spiky fizzy stuff, and it may be a little bit darker than you're used to, I'm not exactly sure, but for me that feels and responds, and when it's on stage behaves, in my experience, a lot more like an amp than an FRFR speaker, because an FRFR speaker has this tweeter kind of thing going on. So I know it doesn't necessarily seem super smart, but I guess again it's a bit of a quick win as well. So with the power cab, some of what I did was send off like splits on a helix. The signal without a cab would go into the power cab, which was running its own kind of thing. and all this sort of stuff. It gets a bit complicated, and then if I was using a fractal device, I'd have to EQ as well, going into the FRFR, different to what was going out the front of house. So for me, this has been by far and away the quickest way to getting a usable tone live. So I know how to get pretty decent tones that I'm looking for out of studio monitors, and I know that when you take these things live, things tend to not work out exactly the same as at bedroom home levels. So plugging into the return of an amp, even in this case with the Line 6 Catalyst, which is, you know, a relatively cheap amp, and it does have a power amp in, but I've got it in the effects loop in mode at the moment, and it's just doing the thing straight away. And I've had the same experience with the Henriksen Bud, which has a tweeter, which I just turn off, and then you can also run that into an external cab, and it's been way better for me. So I think if you've already got a tube amp that you could try this with, or you've got something like Line 6 Catalyst, a relatively inexpensive amp even, can do this job. But as I say, leave your speakers on in the first instance is my advice, because I've tried this with like a Seymour Duncan Power Stage and this stuff as well. If you turn the cab off, you just get a very, very spiky experience in my experience. And as you turn up, that generally gets worse, not better, is what I've found for whatever reason. So if you can get a quick win in this way and not have to set up these kind of patches that do all sorts of complicated things, I would say that if you can find a way to make this work, this might work really nicely. So I just plug out of the headphone out into the power amp, or out of Ascend into the power amp, and that works really nicely for whatever reason. One of the things that might be a negative to this, or people might say, yes, but you're not hearing what the audience hears through the front of house, but you're not anyway. So even if you use an FRFR speaker on stage, or if you use a real amp on stage, the audience hears a different thing to you because they hear it through an SM57, presumably out front. That's not what you hear on stage. Most of what you hear on stage will be from the amp itself, and maybe a little bit coming back through the monitors. In this case, yes, what I'm hearing on stage will be a bit darker and a bit fuller sounding because it's the cab sim going through this speaker. And out front of house, it will probably sound a bit different. I'll actually do that experiment, just switching between the two, the mic here on this speaker and then the actual direct audio, and see what happens. For me, I've just found, well, this at least is simple and easy to set up. At least it sounds, for me, not spiky and gross when I turn it up loud, and it works whether it's a tube amp or the Catalyst or the Henriksen Bud. So I think the FRFR speaker thing for some people is great. I know some people really like some bits and pieces of it, but for me, this to me just sounds more natural, more like a guitar amp, and feels a bit more like it. And so that's why I kind of go a little bit against the grain in this. If people say the first thing you should get is an FRFR speaker, I'd say, well, hold on, there are these cheaper options which I think in many cases take less work, and probably in some cases might even sound a bit closer to what you might be looking for. So let me know your thoughts on that in the comments. The Catalyst is doing a really good job at this, actually, I think. It can be super loud. I'm not sure, I might even take it tonight and try it on a gig, because I think it'd be nice to have an amp that can do sort of two jobs. In the one case, the power cab, I could really only use with a modeler, whereas the Catalyst could by its own be an amp that I could take to a gig and stuff and use with pedals. So it's kind of cool to have things that can do multiple things, I think. Has any one of you tried the Catalyst in this way as well? It's not true FRFR. This is more like a power cab in kind of flat mode, but because it's an actual guitar speaker, because it's an open back cab and stuff, I think you do get quite a nice response out of it, weirdly.